Okay. Right, well, welcome everyone. I'll just share my screen. This time I've decided to share it deliberately on not full screen mode, so you can see my my things at the side, and and you can also see my notes. That means that I won't be able to do the animations, but I'm sure you can keep track anyway without. And it means that if there's anything which comes up which I want to change, I can do so straight onto the screen without messing around. So we'll start off with the topic this time is methods, research into methods and what I'll call sequences, which I'll come on to later. This is what we're going to do in the session. First, start off by defining what method means in the context of English language teaching. Then we'll talk about the Prabhu article a little bit. Some of you read it and got back to me, and some of you didn't, that's fine. And then talk about research into methods and sequences, which are divided into two. One is methods. I'm going to look particularly at task-based language teaching, because that's the one which is most sort of currently researched and talked about. And sequences, sometimes confused with methods, and it doesn't really matter what you call them. And I'm going to talk about PPP and the flipped classroom. So that's the program for today. A method then is defined more or less this is the way Prabhu also defines it, a set of teaching procedures based on some kind of clear underlying rationale of two things. One, what you see language as, what language is, and how it is best learned and by implication taught. So some examples. So grammar translation is based on the premise that language is a collection of grammatical structures and vocabulary, and therefore the best way to teach it is to teach grammatical structures and teach vocabulary and practice them and put them together and so on. Or audiolingualism. Okay, language is a set of habits traditionally, and therefore language is best learned through sort of stimulus response drills and memorizing and repetition and all that sort of thing. Or task-based language teaching based on the premise that language is basically a means of communication and best learned through communication, through communicative interaction. Okay, all okay so far? Anyone want to add anything? Okay, move on. So Prabhu says the idea, when people say there's no best method, he sees that, he doesn't use the word cop out, that's what I'm saying, but that's more or less what he's saying. Does it mean you can do whatever you like and it's therefore it's the end of the discussion, or is it the beginning of a discussion? I was actually at this plenary of his at IATEFL years and years and years ago, so that dates me. And I remember being tremendously impressed. Although his accent was a bit difficult to understand, took a little while to get used to his accent, to understand him. But it was really, really an eye-opener for me. And it's an article which is much quoted, although, as Hugh rightly says, it's a bit wordy and a lot of sort of complicated, perhaps unnecessarily complicated expression, not always observing the rules of Orwell, which I presented last time. So one of the issues he addresses is what is best. If you're talking about a best method, what is the best method? Is it that which leads to most learning? But then that raises a whole lot of questions like is it quality or quantity of learning, how many words you know, or which words you know, or whether your accent is good, or what does it mean? Also the fact that it's not just an additive process, it's not one thing and then another and gradually building up. It's organic, and therefore the increase in language knowledge happens perhaps in unexpected and disorganized ways, which is difficult to plan for. And he also mentions we have to take into account not only what the person has learned, but also the potential for further learning, and the zone of proximal development, the ZPD parenthesis, something which I added as my own interpretation of what he's saying, is actually implying exactly what Vygotsky means by the zone of proximal development. And anyhow, how do you judge? How do you know the students have learned or not learned? It's really a very difficult question. And he has this bit which I really liked, which I'll come back to actually at the end of this session. It's got a sort of ideologically acceptable. No one thing is best. They've all got things going from them, and it's pluralism, and it's respect for the other, and it's, as he says, a liberation from monolithic mold, and espousal of plurality. It is also, however, he says, a denial of the role of understanding in language pedagogy. We understand something when we have a set of ideas or principles that cohere to make a conceptual model or theory. And that way, what he's saying is what he's implying is that we do actually need a method, or we do need a theory. We need an underlying rationale which we believe in and which is the basis of our teaching. We do need, he's implying, to strive for the best. We do need a coherent set of theoretical principle. What he's protesting against, perhaps, or this is the way I understand him, the imposition of some externally popular or fashionable or whatever method. And he says what we actually need is our own, each one of us needs, as it were, our own method, or what he calls Cheetah's sense of plausibility, which is a rather difficult difficult expression. And it turns out, if you look at the quotes on this, I didn't put a page number, but these are direct quotes from the article. What he's actually saying, if you read what he's saying that a sense of plausibility is in fact a method, in the sense that it is the set of procedures that I use with my own underlying principles and beliefs. So it is a method, even though he's saying that there's no best method. What is, if you dig down, what we come to is that he doesn't say there's no such thing as method. What he's saying, perhaps he's making a distinction, this is my distinction, I'll ask you for your comments in a moment, distinction between a method, capital M, published research, advocated or condemned, versus an individual method based on a teacher's sense of plausibility. Okay, I'm going to stop for a moment and ask you if you approve so far, if this is making sense, if you want to comment. So turn on your mics and say something, Hugh.
Yes, well, I found, this idea of an individual method that is theoretically based, that seems, yes, perfect. Common sense, intelligent, and I would say what he's arguing for really is something that I call improvisation. So, if you're, say, creating a rapport in the classroom with the students, then you're adjusting your methods to the individual needs of the students or of the time itself. So where I'm confused is I don't see him succeeding in the claim that he asserts at the beginning of the article. He says different methods for different contexts, that's relativism and is a cop-out, or that all methods are partially useful, true, valid, and the notion of good and bad methods is misguided. I would say I agree with all three of those points, but I don't know if he really proves that argument in the way that he's written the article, which is why I said, did he have a beef with Brumfitt, or was he having a fight with Jack Richardson? It was a plenary.
I don't know, he seems to be fairly in favor of Brumfitt. Jack Richards, yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, anyway.
But basically, what he's doing is he's asserting the right of the teacher to choose
Right.
what's right for him or her in particular contexts or not. Even your own sort of teaching personality, rather than based on something which someone else says is right. Although he says, I can't remember what I put in the next slide. This is the definition of plausibility or method. Implemented consistently in action, constantly changing and developing, shared, influencing, and influenced by other people's methods or plausibility. And by the way, just a slight digression here. I don't know if you've come across this, these two expressions. I find them really useful. Spouse theory versus theory in action. Again, it's a very old book. One of the reasons I put this onto a normal view rather than full screen view is you can see the references at the bottom if you want them in the notes. Argyris and Schoen, 1974, they talk about espouse theory, that which a teacher claims to believe or thinks, or maybe even genuinely thinks they believes they believe, as opposed to the theory in action, which is what they genuinely believe as betrayed by the way they behave in the classroom. And I think that's a really useful distinction and relevant to the topic we're discussing. So what he says, published methods are therefore to be seen as an expression of their supporters' sense of plausibility. So they're also perfectly legitimate senses of plausibility, but they're someone else's, not mine. And therefore not to be adopted wholesale, but to be shared, learned from, influenced, and be influenced. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And that is the basic approach, my approach to methods in general, and the particular methods I'll be discussing in this session. That methods, it's not a question of right or wrong, it's a question of what we can learn from them and how relevant they are or are not to our own situation. Anything else? Hugh, you want to add? Michelle, you want to add something?
I wonder if the focus on flexibility within methods would have an impact on how much thought people give to what language actually is and how language is best learned. To me, it sounds like it's almost a shift away from thinking about whether or not your espoused beliefs are actually connected to your actions, because the focus is so much on, the way I'm interpreting this is that the focus is on the methods, almost detached from your understanding of language.
I think
you know what I mean? I know.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm being clear, but it almost sounds like we've moved now into methods, well, the definition of methods being more applied than theoretical, which I thought the article was arguing that there needs to be coherence between those things.
I think there does absolutely need to be coherence between those things, and when there isn't, that's when you get the conflict between espoused and espoused theory and theory in action. And one of the ways in which we develop is by identifying, you know, I thought I think this, but look what I'm doing. I'm doing something different. Where am I, in fact, and trying to sort of introspect and see how we move forward from there.
I will listen and see what comes next.
Okay, let's move on. Okay, what are some features of your own method sense of plausibility? And what has influenced you in adopting, rejecting features? Anybody? And you can see from mine, I don't know if you can read my notes there, I've written what I would answer to that question. Can you see the notes? Are they visible?
Yes.
They're small, but
Um,
they're visible.
Yeah, I'll make them a bit bigger. But that's sort of what my own sort of informal brainstorming myself. What if someone asked me what my method was, then I'd say something like that. What would you say about yourselves?
Oh,
What
well,
do you
I'll jump
believe?
in and say my sense of engagement and method is probably pretty close to yours, Penny, although I'm not so sure about teacher explanations rather than inductive processes. I mean,
Yeah.
in some ways, I do, in fact, do a lot more explanation, and I've been trying to develop bilingual materials for my university students because they don't seem to have a great ability to talk about strategies or how they're learning in Japanese. So I'm trying to get them to think about basic how to think in English or in Japanese, so that we can think about writing and the relationship between reading.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to say, for example, that, well, when I was young, I studied Spanish, basically audiolingual method. I mean, how long ago? Oh, more than 60 years ago, a long time ago. And I don't believe in the audiolingual method,
Mm-hmm.
but I have a young student, I have a junior high school girl who needs to do a lot of practice. And sometimes just to kind of continue the conversation with her, I get her to, I sometimes translate what she said in Japanese into English and write it down for us to practice reading together. And so we're doing a lot of focusing on, what she needs in order to cope with her cram school and with her junior high school classes. And of course, she has to succeed in the tests in order to get through this sort of business of learning English in school. And so I'm trying to help her develop, sound spelling correspondence, sense of the language.
Yeah.
And so we work on very informally pronunciation, sometimes using basically made up drills. That's just part of how the lesson develops organically on any particular day.
So I'd say, Hugh, that your own sense of plausibility is very much rooted in responding to what you perceive as the student's needs.
Yes.
Rather than imposing your own ideas, listening to them and doing and going with them when selecting procedures and strategies.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, I think that's, good comment.
Helen, Michelle, do you want to say anything here, or you're going to pass?
I'm torn. No, I would briefly, I'd just say that I too think it's important to respond to learners' needs, but I'd add to that that sometimes because we're teaching refugees and immigrants to Canada, so they don't necessarily always know what they need, and so it's helping bridge the contextual needs with what their perceived needs are as well.
Yeah.
And
some students get really irritated with you when you ask them and say, you're the teacher, you ought to know.
Less and less as time goes on. Like I'd say 20 years ago, I got a lot of that. And now people seem to have shifted significantly, at least here in Canada, and their expectations are more aligned with what our methodology is than they were even 10 years ago. It's pretty interesting to see how.
True.
And even even people overseas, because I am also doing some work with people in other countries, and I'm seeing a general shift when I'm talking about huge numbers of people in what their expectations are. It's been interesting. But I also think it's important myself, I think a combination of inductive and explanation is really important. And I lean towards explanation really explicitly because there's a number of people who that really helps. And for those who it doesn't, you can move on after that. But I also feel that people get frustrated if you're too inductive because it can be challenging. Anyway, I'll be quiet now.
Yeah. And use of L1. It's not so relevant with you because you have multilingual classes presumably, whereas you and I
not this semester. I have
monolingual.
Majority Ukrainian refugees this year. So we are experiencing quite a bit of, and it's fine. L2 in the classroom helps, particularly I think at lower levels, and I encourage it. But it has been challenging in that I have a couple of students who are not Ukrainian. I have 3 students out of 20 who are not Ukrainian. And so that balance has been a bit of a challenge to navigate where you don't want them to feel excluded, but at the same time, particularly at the lower levels, which these learners are at, they need to be able to use their L2 in order to learn. I mean, they're L1 in order to learn because there's so little L2.
Yeah.
I think the L1 is an interesting one because obviously I came, coming off the training course and you're told no L1, no L1 in the classroom. And then I joined a language school in a monolingual setting and no, don't use L1. They're spending a lot of money. Just keep talking to them in English. They'll get it. And I think, with experience, you kind of realize that actually that's so, I can't think of the right word. It's just not inclusive at all to suddenly say to these groups of kids or teenagers or adults, no L1, it's just not realistic and it's not the way we're all going. I find that
in
interesting.
a sense, it's going back to Hugh's point. In a sense, it's not listening to them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's taking a method with a big M and applying it wholesale with no criteria whatsoever. I was also thinking about, sorry, I'll just
go ahead,
sorry. Also as an observer, and when I observe other teachers, the number of times your own sense of plausibility comes into play there, and how you should actually allow the teacher to talk about their rationale before you sort of dive in there and say, well, no, why are you teaching in that way, and that way? I think as observers, we often forget to ask them. No, you tell me about it. Right. Sorry, I'll let you go on.
No, I think that's a very good point. Thanks. Okay, where were we? Okay, I'm moving on now to looking at the research on task-based language teaching. Everybody okay with that? You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
So there's two aspects of research that could support it. This course is about research. So I'm looking at what the research can help tell us about, in this case, TBLT. So the theoretical basis supported by research on language acquisition, and the second one, that should be a 2, not a 1, don't know what happened there, empirical research on the effectiveness of task-based language teaching compared with other methods. Is it effective? And so I've made a note to myself there that Chris Brumfitt, as mentioned in Prabhu's article, actually says it's almost impossible to prove or disprove that one method is superior or inferior to another because of the immense number of variables. Just a brief answer to this one, because otherwise we're going to get bogged down. But what do you feel about task-based language teaching? In a word, in general, do you feel favorable towards it or skeptical towards it? And I want an answer from everyone of this, even if it's only a single word.
I'll give 2 words. Very favorable.
Very favorable. Thank you. Yes. Who else?
I'll say favourable.
Okay. I'll say skeptical, just to balance a bit.
I'll say it
Okay.
really adds to learner motivation in an immigrant context.
So favorable adds to motivation. Yeah.
In an
Yanela?
immigrant context,
Ellen?
because people have things they need to do, right? So
Yeah.
it recognizes their needs to them.
Okay. Helen, Yanela?
I've never really used TBLT, so I guess
Uncertain?
uncertain. Yeah.
I
Yanela?
agree. It adds to motivation, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
You've tried it?
Yeah, but again, not. I haven't just tried. I mean, taught just task-based. It's part
Mhm.
of our choice for certain lessons, and yeah, it adds motivation. So I will be in
Great.
favor. Yeah.
Good. Okay, thanks. It's based on two things I said: research on language acquisition and direct research on the method itself and its use in context. Language acquisition is often brought as a rationale for TBLT. Ellis, for example, says traditional approaches, PPP, it's very often contrasted with PPP, which I'll come on to later, do not conform to what is known about acquisitional processes. And Skian talks scathingly about a conservative profession, he means us, a conservative profession out of touch with language acquisition studies. So what he's saying is that language acquisition studies essentially support support TBLT, or the approach underlying TBLT. And I said in my notes that I searched through, Google Scholar and all sorts, and couldn't find any research outside naturalistic language learning. There's a lot of research on first language learning or second language learning in immersion environments now, so a naturalistic situation, which does support learning through communication, but I couldn't find any based on instructed language learning which supported it. I'm still looking. Yes.
Can I just ask, because maybe I misunderstood what you meant by TBLT. So it doesn't exclude integrating other ways of approaching the language, like it doesn't exclude grammar, vocabulary, and all of those things when you're.
It doesn't.
Okay.
But what it says is that the basic unit of learning within a lesson should be the communicative task, which should involve student interaction, and any focus on form should grow out of that and be secondary to the communicative framework. No, it does not exclude.
Thanks for clarifying.
It just puts it in a sort of dependent role. Okay. Okay, this is just emphasizing the point that very frequently TBLT is claimed to rest on what is known about acquisition, natural language acquisition, but this tends to be, as pointed out by Spada, I'll come on to that in a moment, tends to be based on naturalistic language acquisition. So there's similarities which have been found within naturalistic language acquisition studies have been firstly similar sequences of acquisition. In other words, the order in which grammatical structures are acquired seems to be the same whether you're learning something as a second language or as a first language. So, and the argument is, and there's similar errors also, and the argument is that if first languages are acquired through purposeful communication, then as our second languages in an immersion situation, like for immigrants, for example, so instructed second language lesson should work the same way. And I've put my own question mark there because I'm not quite sure whether the logic there is watertight, but hence the communicative approach and task-based learning. And the Spada article I mentioned, and anything written by Lightman and Spada I read, I think they're brilliant. very sensible and also solidly research grounded. And Sparta does point this out, that after a couple of decades of instructed second language research, evidence accumulated against the notion that comprehensible input is sufficient for L2 learning. So in other words, Prashan probably on his own, Prashan's ideas about the input hypothesis are not enough to furnish a solid basis for a methodology for learners in an instructed situation outside a naturalistic immersion situation. And this is supported by the two studies I've quoted at the bottom there. So yes, so we need some grammar instruction, vocabulary instruction, whatever. But this still doesn't mean that we therefore have to abandon the idea of the communicative task as a basis. You can retain that and say, okay, we'll put in the grammar and the vocabulary in a focus on form process within a task-based method. Slight problem here, there's lots of different interpretations of what focus on form actually consists of. And I'll be talking about this. One of our sessions later is on teaching grammar, and I'll come on to that in more detail then. Swan has a very stringent essay against TBLT, where he says that the roots in second language research are dubious, and he worries about the fact that a task-based methodology does not allow enough space for teacher input and the provision of basic vocabulary and grammar and everything for low-level learners. It's all very well to say, go in and do this task and learn through interaction and communication, but if you haven't got anything to communicate with, how do you do that? And he thinks there should be an important place for input of basic language items before you start doing tasks. But this actually is accepted by some people who are using TBLT, so we'll come on to that in a moment. So that's on language acquisition, and now research on the effectiveness of TBLT as a method. And the key article here, research articles, Rafalski and McKay, 2019 in Language Teaching Research, where they did a meta-analysis. They took all sorts of situations where TBLT is being implemented and looked at its success and came to the conclusion that overall, in most places, it was in fact successful, that where you had two groups, one was using TBLT and the other wasn't, the TBLT group progressed better, or where TBLT on its own was only being used, there were good results. And this is their abstract. So I'll give you a moment just to look through that. And of course, I've uploaded the full article to the Dropbox folder, so if you want to have a look at it, you can. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And this is their conclusion. So in general, look, it succeeded in lots of places, therefore it is an effective pedagogy in a variety of contexts. They're not saying everybody should use it, but they're saying that in a lot of different places, it's very successful. And we should consider this. We do need, however, to take into account the following. This is my own critical comments, okay? So different interpretations of task-based language teaching. I'll come on to that later. How much focus on form are you doing? How much is the lesson actually built on communicative tasks, and how much is form focused? We need to take into account that when I looked at the the classes they will look at, the vast majority were adult learners. There were some young learners and some teenage learners. The majority were adults. But you remember I said last week that one of the problems with research into language teaching is that most researchers are looking at adult learners because they're the most accessible to them. They're the ones in their university they can study most easily. And therefore most studies tend to be based on adult learners. Where they were contrasting with grammar-based, very often it was not really a fair contrast because the other group was doing a rather extreme and, to me anyway, unacceptably constrained grammar-based methodology. A lot of the studies had to do with the development of oral skills, and I think this is one of the very strong points of TBLT, that it does contribute a lot to skills, particularly the development of oral skills, because you're doing a lot of communicative interaction, and therefore the development of oral skills is likely to be developed well. Finally, there's the point about cultural aspects, and there's been a lot of research studies by Carl Less, which I'll come on to in a moment, and this one, which I've quoted, Gian Fan 2020, where the use of a TBLT in China was problematic because of the culture of learning, because of what the students were used to and not used to. Another piece of research often quoted as a criticism of TBLT is Seedhouse, who looked at and recorded students doing communicative tasks based on an information gap. They had to tell each other, in this case, they were telling each other how to draw things or how to put things in relation to one another. And what it shows is that the language used is very often very minimal and difficult to see how the students are in fact moving forward and learning new language when they are actually getting their ideas across in the minimum possible. You do just lexical items with very, very little another issue which needs to be raised with relation to TBLT is materials. There are no task-based courses that I know of. Now, Hugh, do you know of any? I might just not be informed.
Is Cutting Edge not task-based learning? The course book by...
I'll have a look at that. I have Cutting Edge on.
I think Cutting Edge might be.
I'll
I'll need to check that. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I'll check that. Thanks, Emma. Many include communicative tasks. There's a lot more communicative tasks within conventional textbooks than there used to be. And Tomlinson also says this. He says in the 2020 summary, coursebook publishers do not implement research-based insights. He even goes so far as to say that, I'll come on to this later, that coursebooks tend to be based on PPP.
Oh.
Or dare I say it, doesn't work very well in many contexts. Or I'm interpreting TBLT too narrowly, and possibly a weak version or a more flexible version does work well. Carl Less, for example, suggests that a TBLT would work better if we had more proactive grammar vocabulary teaching, language exercises, more input-based procedures. And so we move on to Rod Ellis's approach. And Rod Ellis is very much in favor of TBLT in general, but he calls it an approach, not a method. So he's a bit more sort of generalized and cautious in the way he defines it. And he accepts a lot of components associated with more traditional methods, for example, pre-teaching of necessary language, use of texts that focus on particular linguistic factors, so actually not using natural authentic text, but actually, as it were, engineering your text so that they provide the language that you want your students to learn. And then there's this phrase task supported rather than task based in a research which Lee, also Ellis, did in 2016. So my conclusion, I'll throw it open for discussion in a moment. I don't think that the research will can possibly justify its conclusion that TBLT is the best method. We've already seen that we're not sure that there is such a thing. But there is evidence that TBLT does work well in many situations. And perhaps particularly for adult learners, for skills development, it needs to be adapted sensitively to different teaching contexts. So that's my conclusion. I throw it open now to yours. What would you say?
I'm wondering whether a lot of the research done is particularly where I am. There's a lot of work being done in CLIL teaching, and I wonder whether some of that is a more task-based approach. So this would be teaching with young learners and teenagers. I mean, my own feeling is that it is being used, and at the young learner level, I think there are a lot of course books which take a more kind of story-based approach, which again would reflect, I don't know, I might be wrong. I'm open to.
Story-based where? With young learners?
With young learners, yeah.
Didn't mean to put that in capital letters. So story-based. Yeah. Both CLIL and the story-based approach actually mesh well with TBLT, don't they? So that would be, yes.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Well, I have a lot of science students who, in the Japanese university context, are quite resistant to English. In fact, they often chose science and math because they didn't need high English test scores to get into the university.
Mm-hmm.
But now they're getting a lot of pressure from the heads of department. They're being told they have to get, TOEIC scores, they have to meet test-based assessment, and they're finding, of course, in IT or engineering, they need to work with people from other countries using English as a lingua franca. So what I'm really doing is sort of task-based for some kinds of practice, but really project-based. So if I have my students learn how to do research, learn how to read science articles, work on the grammar and vocabulary as a regular practice, but also do 4 or 5 to 7 minute presentations a semester in groups, then when it really works, they use English with each other, and all of the side comments about their presentations, they start really using English to have fun.
That must make you feel really good.
Oh yeah, it's great. I mean, I just sort of sit and watch from a distance, and they're saying, "Oh, that's really interesting," or yeah.
Great.
So I feel,
Yeah.
oh, good, this is happening. Great.
Yeah.
In
So
terms of
these,
the
we're
CLIL,
talking about the three ideas that come here are variations on task-based. They're still essentially communicative tasks.
Yes.
can I just
Yeah.
say that we did something similar for 8 or 9 years when I was working for the Polytechnic, but what was really interesting to me was we had the good fortune to be able to do observations and research and take a look at the examinations and the texts and everything, so that we could assess what kind of language were creating obstacles for the students in each of the programs. And the students obviously could give us, we interviewed them individually and in groups to find out where they were having the challenges. And each of the programs was significantly different in terms of whether the challenges were more speaking and listening, or were they reading and writing, and then what kinds of challenges were, how much of them were grammar based, and how much of them were other pragmatics or other kinds of issues that would come up. For example, nurses going into a end of life situation in a clinical environment, what kind of language did they need, as opposed to the auto mechanics working in a group trying to listen to instructions. And their reading, the auto mechanics reading, is significantly different from any other kind of reading scenarios that I've encountered with learners. So it was fascinating to then be able to tailor the language that the learners needed to be successful in their programs, depending on what the program needed. And the language needs were so different from one program to another that it was, I can't imagine doing it any other way, right? Because the books that I've seen on language for medicine or language for engineering or whatever don't do justice to what the learners actually need when they're in the programs.
Yeah. Really difficult. So you have to do
And
a thorough needs analysis and move on from there.
But
Yeah.
so rewarding, because then and motivating for the learners, because then they're learning what they actually need to be able to be successful.
Yeah.
And although there's been a lot of resistance to the Common European Framework, for example, I think one of the purposes of that was to encourage teachers to look for real life outcomes. So my student will be able to do certain things. And I think that has led to a more task-based classroom. I mean, certainly in my own teaching, that I would tend to say at the beginning of a class, even with young learners, by the end of the class, this is the kind of situation you'll be able to cope with. And that's more motivating. I think we're talking about motivation, aren't we?
Yeah. Well, that's it. I mean, when you say the research doesn't necessarily show that it's and I want to look at that article more carefully, right? Like because there are so many variables, and motivated learners often learn more quickly. And I have found that that's it, just in my own logic, that's in an immigrant context, task-based is extremely important because people are so focused on survival communication.
What I've written, does that represent what you're saying? Is that okay? The point about TBLT being good for motivation, which I think is a point you brought up right at the beginning of this discussion. Yeah.
And Emma, I just agree with you. We have the Canadian language benchmarks, which is based on the European framework. And I think a lot of the language teaching modeling that's gone on here is based on that.
Yeah. Nice. Okay. Let's move on to PPP, which I don't think is a methodology. I think it's a sequence. Which can be used within various different methodologies. Although it is very often in the literature contrasted. When I was preparing this session, I came up again and again against this thing that writers were comparing TBLT with PPP. So this is the definition, which I won't spend too much time because I'm sure you all know this. You know, the very strong TBLT proponents, the more extreme ones like Skian, define practice as mechanical drills. Okay, but it isn't just mechanical drills, it's any kind of focused practice of language forms, and it doesn't have to be grammar, although some people define presentation as only grammar. It isn't only grammar, it's also any new bit of language which you're teaching, often vilified in the literature. Quotes here, and there's plenty of them. This is just a selection.
Where's the evidence does not work?
Yes, well, exactly. Where's the evidence? And that's why I put it in. But this is
it does not work.
He says something like, Skian often likes to say it does not work. And as Michael Swan points out, there's no real evidence that it doesn't work or that it does work for them. And there's no evidence either way, and you can't really make categorical statements like this and get away with it.
And I don't understand why it's contrasted with TBLT, because it sounds like it's very much a part of. teaching, right? As is TBLT.
Well, I mean, if you look in literature all the time, you find it all over the place. That it's contrasted as if, you know, it's one extreme and another extreme. But persists. TBLT, I mean, PPP, for some reason, refuses to die. I mean, everybody's been killing it for years and it refuses to lie down. Tomlinson, here's a nice quote from Tomlinson about its use in a lot of textbooks. This is 2020, it's fairly recent. Why? Why does it persist? Why doesn't it lie down? Well, partly it has some sort of theoretical substance in skill theory, which has been particularly promoted by De Keyser in his writings. I'll give a reference in a second, where you learn language like you learn any other skill by being told how something works, or so you're given a grammatical rule or told about words or pronunciation. You then practice it until what you've been told becomes automatized in actual action and speech. So it's got a nice basis in that theory. And De Keyser, as I said, is making a comeback. Various studies here, I particularly like De Keyser's title, "Don't Throw Out the Baby with the Bathwater," which we have a tendency to do, or at least methodologists have a tendency to do. And the last one, 2017, Anderson has a potted history of PPP with the help of the ELT Journal. And he looked at where PPP is discussed in articles in the ELT Journal over the last few decades. And he comes up with this very interesting diagram. Against PPP is the dotted thing, right? Neutral is gray and black is in favor. And if you look at 1991 to 1995, so strongly against and very little in favor. And then it's gradually changing. And by the time you get to the last decade, you've got almost nothing, or nothing in ELT anyway, ELT Journal, which is strongly against, and the most of it is either neutral or in favor. So I think there is evidence for some kind of comeback or some kind of compromise or some kind of understanding that a version of PPP is actually compatible with TBLT.
Can I guess
Um,
that part of that
yeah.
is that it may have been used in grammar translation, and so people were reacting against the sort of
Exactly.
automatic mechanical use of PPP
Yeah.
back in the day, and that now
and indeed audiolingualism.
Yeah.
Same thing. So it was very largely a reaction against. And now we've calmed down and stopped reacting and looking and saying, this works, this doesn't, and how does this work well, and how does this doesn't work? How does it not? There's
also
a
a
more,
really, sorry.
Yes, Emma.
I was going to say, it's also a really useful crutch for new teachers. I mean, you teach them a model like that, and it really gives them something to hold on to.
Trying to hold on to, yeah, and vary from as time goes on, but at least it's something to start with. I think you're right.
And if we're in very large classes where the constraints are so severe, I mean, in Japan, university classes tend to meet once a week. So you have maybe 45 or 60 students that you're going to see once a week for 90 minutes.
Wow.
And to try to give them some input and something to practice. I mean, it's dangerous. Like we slide into the what Prabhu calls over routinization too easily. But if you can use it as a starting point and then move into more task-based or project-based activities, then at least there's a foundation for working with the language, right?
Absolutely. Tricky to see where these things work, where they don't work, and how they can combine with one another for optimal results in different situations. And the extreme view that it's either or this is good and this is bad, I think we need to move away from and find ways of combining into a rational and learning rich process for our particular students in our particular situations. Let me move on because I'm running out of time. I don't really want to keep you much beyond the hour if I can help it. The flipped classroom is my last topic here. Also, I also call it a sequence because it's not really a method. It's you know about this. Okay, don't need to explain it. Okay. Have any of you tried it?
Yes, quite a lot.
And how does it work, Hugh?
Well, given the time constraints of many of my courses, if the students can do practice outside of the classroom and prepare for activities in the classroom, it's, I think, quite useful.
Do practice outside the classroom rather than input?
Well, both.
Both. Okay.
So if you're getting input, whether it's a recorded lecture or a reading passage with audio, or use a YouTube video, for example, and have them read the text or read the transcript, and then do some kind of work with the language from the lesson outside of the classroom, and then bring that to the classroom for further activities or extension.
Yeah. Anybody else had experience of using it? Michelle?
Yeah, I did it quite a bit in teaching a bridging program for nurses and higher level learners, and very focused on a particular profession. And it was extremely motivating, and it allowed us to move at a much faster pace.
Good comment.
I had, first of all, it's popular also because it uses online tools. It means less lecturing in the classroom, and the classroom is used for interactive discussion. And there's been some good results, bearing out what you just said about your students. But and this is personal communication. I had two interactions with people about flipped classroom, and one was a teacher from Holland teaching high school students. He said, but often they don't do the preliminary viewing, and as soon as they don't view the preliminary lecture, there's no way you can have a discussion about the lecture, because a third of the class haven't seen it. So where does that leave you? And then I had another conversation with a teacher at Tel Aviv University. No, it was the Hebrew University in Jerusalem University. And she said that she tried it with, she didn't call it flipped classroom, she didn't know the concept, but she said she asked them to look at her lecture in advance, and then they'd discuss it in class. And she said that several of them, even at university level, didn't do it. And she eventually abandoned the process because too many students weren't doing it, even at university level. So it is definitely a problem. On the other hand, where it does work, it works well.
And there's things you can do to mitigate it, right? If you have a really interesting puzzle or problem to solve, and it's presented before you give them the activity to do, whether it's audio or YouTube or whatever it is, and then you follow up by ensuring it,
now,
they can't
participate.
participate.
A really interesting thing you just said, because the research I'm coming on to in a moment says exactly that if you give them some kind of problem solving, not input, but some kind of problem solving to do in advance, and then the input and the discussion, it works much, much better. So that really comes together nicely. But when I was preparing this, I looked at in depth at this particular study, between EFL low proficiency students learning an empirical study, and it's from Language Teaching Research, which is a very prestigious peer-reviewed journal, and very strongly in favor of the flipped classroom for low proficiency students. But when I read the article, well, I'll let you judge. I'll show you what I found. The experimental group and a contrast group, okay? This is what the experimental group, the flipped classroom group, as it were, this is what they have to do. Okay, can I move on?
Sure.
And the contrast group did this. In both cases, they were teaching them some grammar. They didn't actually say what. But it doesn't seem to me a fair comparison.
Adjective clauses for lower proficiency students.
Ah, okay. Right. The experimental group did much, much more and had much more interaction. And the contrast group was taught very, very traditionally, just doing explanation and practice. So it wasn't really a contrast between flipped and non-flipped. It was a contrast between traditional top-down teacher-fronted teaching of a grammatical structure and interactive teaching. And Kapoor et al., the references there below, criticizes this sort of research and says, and this really resonated with me, he said that the success of flipped classroom processes can be largely attributed to added time. Students are actually getting more time.
Yeah.
And it's not because it's flipped, it's because they're actually getting more exposure and more teaching learning. And this is a quote from the from his their conclusions. Other criticisms, and the interesting one is B, isn't it? That the in their review of the research on the flipped classroom, they found that it was most successful when a lecture was included in the follow-up lesson. It wasn't just interaction, but it also included input. And D, which is what you said before, problem solving as a prior activity increased in effectiveness in both models. So really, really interesting, and I recommend reading this. Really, really. Anyone like to comment on this?
I think it would be difficult to find appropriate input for lower proficiency students. That's I can't imagine doing it extremely effectively at very lower levels. I think intermediate and above, I could see, but I find it more challenging to think of having people working independently when they're only beginning to acquire the language.
And this this research actually affected very much my planning of this present course, because I was wondering whether to do the sessions, you know, whether give the input, ask you to read articles and then devote these sessions only to discussion, or whether to include input plus discussion in the sessions, which is what I'm doing, and then further discussion in the forum. And in the end, I decided, very, very influenced actually by this research I've just shown you, that the sessions when we're actually all present, there should also be input as well as discussion, not just the input outside the lesson. So that's something I've learned from that. What do you think?
I think it's a question of time, and I'm trying to think, because in my own case, I really struggle during the week to do much work outside, you know, what I'm doing already, much reading, etc., etc. So I'm thinking about the flipped classroom approach, if the students, somebody commented they don't do the preliminary reading, well, maybe they just didn't have the moment to do it, and
Yeah.
whether that kind of time needs to be structured into the course. I don't know. Maybe they should be all put in a room and said, right, now you're going to do the flip bit, or
Yeah.
I don't know.
But then why not just have an ordinary lesson?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Eh,
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, okay, I don't want to keep you longer, so I just wanted to add as a postscript this one, which you can look at your leisure. Alan Waters, who sadly died, he was a brilliant thinker and researcher into language teaching. And one of the things which he said was that our choice of method and procedures and so on is, although we may not be aware of it, very much influenced by current thinking or if you like, PC type thinking, that the need to recognize and oppose inequalities, prejudice, stereotyping, and so on, and therefore the powerful teacher versus the disempowered learner, right? Or the teacher telling versus the teacher bottom-up facilitating learner, the teacher fronted versus collaborative, use of a textbook versus, well, leave that with the 3 dots of not use of a textbook, like that. But this is a really interesting article to read if you have time, and we're all short of time. But anyway, I've put it into the Dropbox folder if you'd like to have a look at it, because I think that he has a point that in many cases and in many places, the choice of method is influenced, though we may not be aware of it, by our general approach to things in general, the spirit of the times, if you like, or what is currently acceptable or unacceptable in the environment where we're teaching. Okay, thank you very much for your attention and patience and participation. And yeah, so I'll set up a forum if anyone wants to add things, and the reading for next time is already up on the website. We'll be talking about corrective feedback, error correction. And I will let you go your separate ways because we're all so busy and you have lots to do, unless there's anything, any final word any of you would like to contribute at this point.
Say thank you.
Yep, I was
Thank
going to say thank you. This is great. This is really
Okay,
good.
I'm still waiting for more feedback, incidentally, on how you think the sessions are run. Please get in touch with me if there's anything you feel you'd like to tell me.
Mhm.
Thank you. Okay,
Thanks.
bye for now then.
See you next
Thanks.
week.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good job. Good job, Penny.
I
I was
can't seem to
listening in.
close down. Can you close down?
Yeah, let me come back in. I made you the host. So let me reclaim host and then I can close it.
Okay.